Well, hello again and welcome to this week's Wednesday webinar. Thank you for joining us, whether you're watching this live or as a recording later on. I'm Tim Ferguson. I'm part of the ministries team at the Baptist Union. We are actually approaching the end of this series of weekly webinars. After today, we have just two more before we're going to take a pause, and we may well continue with some webinars, but probably at a lower frequency. If you're watching this and you want to comment on that or give us any feedback about that, do email ministries@baptist.org.uk. So in the next couple of weeks, as usual, just an advert for what's coming up. Next week, we have a webinar called What Would the Celts Do in Lockdown? And that's going to be led by Roy Searle and Leslie McLean, both of whom are connected to the Northumbria community. And we'll be thinking about how a Celtic spirituality would address these strange days. So that is next Wednesday on the 8th of July. And the final webinar in this particular series is going to be on the 15th of July, 2 weeks' time. Very practical webinar called Video and Streaming Solutions for Churches. Many churches I know are continuing to meet digitally for the time being, even though some of the restrictions around churches meeting have been relaxed. So we're going to be looking about how you do that effectively. And Mike Lowe, who is communications manager at the BU, will be joined by Ben Stacey from Plugged In Audio Visual, and they'll be talking more to that subject. But today, our webinar has a particularly biblical emphasis, and the title is The Apostle Paul's Lockdown Ministry. We're going to think about how the Apostle Paul practiced his ministry from the constraints of self-isolation, prison, and house arrest, and what we might learn from that. So I want to welcome to our screen Andrew Clarke and Simon Jones. Andrew is my equivalent actually at the Baptist Union of Scotland. He heads up their ministerial development programme there. And before his current role with the BUS, he was Professor of New Testament Studies at the University of Aberdeen. And Simon is Vice Principal with responsibility for ministerial formation at Spurgeon's College. So Andrew and Simon, really warm welcome and thank you for joining us today. So Andrew's going to kick us off in a moment or two with a presentation, and then Simon's going to respond to that. Just to say, as ever, do put your comments and questions in during the webinar. We'll pick them up at the end and try to address them, but do use a chat box for that purpose as we go. So without further ado, let's Simon and I are going to get out of the way and hand over to Andrew, who will lead us in this first part.
Thank you very much, Tim. So the Apostle Paul's lockdown ministry. One of the things I'm really interested in looking at is how our own familiarity and how perceived similarities that we have with biblical sources are two of the very powerful influences that we have on how we interpret the Bible. And one of the things I'd like us to do today, under this heading of the Apostle Paul's lockdown ministry, is to take a look at some of the various assumptions that we have about Paul and about his ministry, and see how these assumptions become hermeneutical lenses, how they dictate what we do and we don't see in the text. So today I've come up with three slightly playful headings, and I'm deliberately wanting to look at this topic of Paul's lockdown ministry from a slightly left field approach, to challenge perhaps some of the assumptions that we have about Paul and his ministry. So my first heading is Paul's voluntary self-isolation, assuming that he did at some point take this period of self-isolation. There's a 12-year period that you may well have heard about. The sources that we have are relatively silent about this post-conversion period for Saul. Somewhere between AD 31, 32, following his Damascus Road conversion, and his Antioch ministry in AD 44. But what should we make of these so-called silent years? And I think for a long time, I have drawn the conclusion that in some ways these were years of preparation, but perhaps even analogous to Jesus's 40 days prior to embarking on his ministry, time in the desert. And was this for Paul, time in a desert before embarking on a longer ministry? But as we look at some of the texts, and we're going to look at a few of these texts, skipping around a little bit, just to shed a little bit more light on various aspects of Paul's ministry. So if we're going to look at Acts chapter 9, this is immediately after his conversion. Let me read just a few words there from Acts chapter 9. Saul was with the disciples at Damascus, so this is immediately after that conversion. Immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues. Now that sounds to me very much like a Markan immediately. There's pace here, there's race in the story, there's continuity, and Saul is immediately continuing in some form of new ministry. He proclaimed Jesus in the synagogue. And later on, Saul increased all the more in strength, and he confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Messiah. There's some amazement that we read about in the middle of that paragraph there. Some amazement, perhaps at the immediate transformation of Saul, perhaps at the emphasis that Paul had on talking about Jesus as Messiah. And we also see at the foot there of that section that Saul is increasing all the more in strength in regard to this ministry. So our first observation is that post-conversion, what does Paul get on to do? He is immediately involved in the synagogues, proclaiming that Jesus is the Messiah. Let's move on a little bit to a few further verses further down in Acts chapter 9, and we see that opposition then takes the frame. When many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill Saul, but his disciples took him by night and led him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. That sounds a little bit like some of Jesus's opposition that he faced, but it was also something of the story that Paul experienced all the way through the accounts that we find in Acts. Opposition from the Jews. And then moving on to Paul's own words in 2 Corinthians, we're still in Damascus here, still in the immediate post-conversion period. At Damascus, King Aretas of, Arabia, Nabatean Arabia, was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. And you can see the parallels there between Luke's account and what we find in Paul's own words. So many days of preaching led to Jewish opposition, and Paul leaves there and heads off to, he describes this as Arabia or Nabatean Arabia, which isn't the Arabia that we would place geographically far further south. Rather, this is a prosperous, not especially desert region, east of the Jordan, north east, or take Damascus and head out further east. So relatively prosperous, not necessarily desert region, so populated. And a question that I'm asking is, what is he doing in this period? Is he getting his books out and studying, or doing something else? Let's move on to Paul's words in Galatians, where here he talks again about his conversion. He who calls me was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. No surprise for us there. I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. That ties in with what we saw in 2 Corinthians and what we saw in Acts 9. And after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem. So this calling was in order that I might preach among the Gentiles. We've seen that immediately after his conversion, that is precisely what he did go and do. And he received some opposition immediately for that. So my question is, does he then head out to Arabia and stop this preaching and simply open his books and study? He had his message about the Messiah as the Son of God, or do we assume instead that in this fairly well-populated era, he simply continued to preach? He continued to preach. What did Paul do in self-isolation? Well, did he really have a period of self-isolation? Was it not instead evangelism and opposition from the outset? So if we combine these limited sources that we have together with some careful reading between the lines, I wonder whether rather than a period of voluntary self-isolation, we've instead got Paul simply seeking to separate himself from immediate opposition in one town and then continuing to preach the gospel east of Jordan while remaining independent of Jerusalem. If that's the case, it's rather more like the ministry of Jesus, who moved around and spent time in the Decapolis east of the Jordan, but was always focusing on preaching. So I'm challenging at this stage my long-held belief that we have a period of voluntary self-isolation. That's my first heading. My second is Paul in lockdown itself. We are all well aware of a number of periods of imprisonment for Paul in Philippi, in Jerusalem itself, and then across to Caesarea and Rome. And those last three were on a journey that marks much of the later period of the book of Acts. So Paul is no stranger to lockdown. Very likely not lockdown as we now know it, but nonetheless, what did ministry look like for Paul during these repeated periods of lockdown? If he felt that his calling was to preach, what did Paul do when he had no audience? Many of us as ministers are finding that we don't have an immediate audience in front of us now on a Sunday. Paul lost his audience whilst he was in prison. And what did he do during these periods? It's not controversial at all that during lockdown, much of Paul's letter writing was done. He draws attention to this time and again in his letters, those letters that were written while in chains. Colossians, Ephesians, Philemon, Philippians, a series of letters written while in chains. Less high profile, I think, is Paul's use during these particular times of lockdown of partners, people who were his co-workers and worked with him and for him, were sometimes in his presence and sometimes elsewhere. Timothy, Titus, Epaphroditus. And we tend to downplay these figures, and even to the extent of not recognizing where they are Paul's co-authors and co-writers in his letters. In fact, I want to suggest that we tend to rank different aspects of Paul's ministry. At the top level, the gold standard is Paul's preaching through means of personal presence. Secondly, we might say, not quite so good, but coming up a good second is his use of representatives like Timothy, Titus, Epaphras, and Epaphroditus. And thirdly, if you can't have either of those, then you're not going to do too badly, we hope, with a letter that is mediated by these envoys. And this has been a long-held view amongst scholars as well. And so if that's the case, during lockdown, we are working with what may be second best or third best. We don't have Paul in person. I want to challenge that a little bit with some other scholarship that has emerged in the last couple of decades. And I've got this question here. Was Paul always effective with face-to-face ministry? Is this almost an unspeakable question? But it concerns the effectiveness of Paul's face-to-face ministry, this gold standard aspect of what Paul did. We know, we have read and heard today that Paul faced opposition and criticism. We know this from Acts, we know this from Paul's own letters. We also know that some perceived a mismatch between Paul's face-to-face ministry and his letter-writing ministries. Your mind is maybe going directly to 2 Corinthians 10. Let me read a few verses from 2 Corinthians 10. I do not want to appear to be frightening you with my letters, for some say, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech of no account. What we say by letter when absent, we do when present, Paul insists. But nonetheless, Paul is aware that some say, his bodily presence, is that the gold standard, or do we actually find far more effective his letters? His verbal speeches to us, his preaching was of no account, some detractors say. So, occasionally, perhaps not universally, criticized for not being a compelling or engaging in-person speaker. Were his letters more helpful? We are, of course, eternally indebted to him for those letters. But I just wonder whether we can hold out for the fact that in some ways these letters may have presented something of greater clarity, more effectiveness in Paul's ministry than had we met him face to face. The other point I think we should take on board is that Paul often came across conflict, both in churches and out of churches. And he used mediating envoys as an effective solution for these. His envoys had a number of key roles. We might view them as representatives, as ambassadors, as intermediaries or mediators. They had the authority of the person they were representing, not a second best. They had a bi-directional role, so that not only were they representing Paul to the church, but they would feed back to Paul. And in addition, in moments of conflict that we've already thought about, they might have had a mediating role. Some verses from 2 Corinthians 1 that suggest, you're going to have to read between the lines here, something about awkwardness in Paul's experience with the Corinthians. I wanted to come to you first so that you might have a second experience of grace. And then was there some vacillating? Shall I go? Shall I not go? And he says, it was to spare you that I refrained from coming again to Corinth. But I made up my mind not to make another painful visit to you. I wrote as I did so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice. There's something there. No doubt some things aren't being spoken, but there's a tension there. And he sends an envoy. Let's move on to later in 2 Corinthians, to 2 Corinthians chapter 7. God comforted us by the coming of Titus, not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted by you. There's this, Titus has been to the Corinthians and now come back, and he has conveyed comfort to the Corinthians and conveyed it back again to Paul. Paul rejoices at the joy of Titus, the reports that he received from the Corinthians. So in this sense, The envoys are of Timothy, Titus, Epaphras, and Epaphroditus fulfill a very significant role that Paul might not have been able to convey as effectively. A very short quotation from an American scholar called Margaret Mitchell. This was a key paper that got me to question about the importance of envoys and see them in a new light. We must question the assumption, Margaret Mitchell says, that Paul sent envoys and wrote letters as only inadequate substitutes, a make, do and mend, because Paul is unfortunately in lockdown. A substitute for his own physical presence because of the busyness of his schedule. Margaret Mitchell urges us to see that in some instances, intermediaries and letter writing may have offered the best and most effective means for Paul's missionary work. So that's point 2. And finally, and quite briefly, I think, to my third point. Paul, and here you'll see the tongue-in-cheek side of what I'm drawing attention to. Paul and home schooling. When incarcerated, were Paul's only options to write letters and send envoys? I want to draw your attention to a fascinating book by Brian Rapsky that focuses entirely on Paul in Roman custody. Looks at how incarceration was experienced by Paul and how this would have impacted on his ministry. Let me read this quotation. Paul was probably held initially, this is, we're looking at Acts 28 now in Rome, held initially within and later in the vicinity of the Praetorian barracks at Rome. He would be a complete stranger to the man setting his custody. Paul was permitted to live by himself with unrestricted access in private rented accommodation. Security provisions included the permanent presence of a soldier guard to whom, it seems, Paul was regularly, though lightly, chained. Not always was this the case, but here was a period of home arrest, house arrest, and we see at the end of Acts what Paul did whilst here. Let's read, look at some verses in Acts 28. You'll know this passage. When we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. After 3 days, he called together the local leaders of the Jews. He said to them, "It is because of the hope of Israel that I'm wearing this chain." And then from morning till evening, he expounded about the law of Moses, about the kingdom of God, the prophets. And for 2 years, he continued to teach. Whilst in lockdown, he was involved in home schooling. It wasn't that throughout this time he could only resort to envoys and writing letters. So drawing all those 3 points together, I want to suggest that for Paul, it's all about the gospel. He's committed at all times and in all places, whether in lockdown or not, to find opportunity to preach the gospel, to minister to churches, and he does this by all available means. Personal presence, letters, envoys, and he is well aware, perhaps even humbly aware, that others may be more effective channels in some contexts than Paul appearing in person. Tim.
Andrew, thank you so much. Just so much to think about there. I love the idea particularly of envoys, not necessarily as a second best, but with particular advantages. But before I make any questions or comments, we're going to bring Simon in to join us. And Simon's going to just talk with Andrew for a while and just converse about what's been presented to us. Simon.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. I really enjoyed that. And lots of interesting insights. I wonder about this idea of Paul being in lockdown in his early years or Paul being in isolation, because as you have demonstrated, he seemed to be the busiest he was ever during his life, because he seemed largely to be out of prison and free to travel and to do the work that he sensed himself that he was called to, which is to proclaim the gospel to particularly non-Jewish people. But I also wonder, were it not for Acts, we would actually only know Paul as a writer. He is a person who has written a series of letters to us. And when we think of writers, we think of people who are often on their own. Now, for Paul, I'm guessing that writing would not be an entirely solo activity, because largely writing was not him holding a pen, but him shouting words across a workshop to somebody who was writing it down for him. But it is quite an isolated activity, being a writer. And I think it's quite interesting to think of Paul in that way, writing to groups and congregations that he had a relationship with. I like to talk to my students about the fact that instead of seeing Paul as a minister, like many of them are training to be, we should see Paul as an artisan craft worker who planted churches as he went about making tents, kind of literally, as opposed to using tent making as a metaphor. He worked for a living. He worked with his hands, and he told stories, and he founded communities, and he wrote to those communities. And one of the images that came to me as I was thinking about this was of Martin Luther King in Birmingham jail, where he had been challenged by other Christian leaders in the Birmingham area in the United States to justify what he was doing. And so he penned this now great letter of kind of explaining to these people why he was doing it and why he felt it was right for him to do it. It seems to me it's an essential piece of literature for ministerial formation. So all my students, I set it as something for them to read and to reflect on. But it seems to me to capture something of what Paul is doing as a letter writer. He is writing to various communities in order to spell out some of the implications of what he has maybe done with them in person. The other thing that I'm very struck by when I'm thinking about what Paul is like, if we find a contemporary image of him, is that he is less like a minister and more like a community organizer. He is somebody who pulls people together for a specific purpose, not necessarily in a specific place, but for a specific purpose. So he kind of works as a community organizer, and he's organizing communities that are distinct from the surrounding culture, but which have a role within that culture to embody something of the gospel. And I think that's quite a helpful way of thinking about him. And then when you apply that to him writing letters, a lot of what he's writing about in his letters is how the communities that he's writing to should organize themselves. He's talking about being together, building community, being of a common mind, as he talks about in Philippians, sorting out particular issues that there are that maybe are making the communities not function as well as they should. And even in a letter like Galatians, which is kind of angry and theological, the subtext is that he wants these people to agree with each other so that they can be effective communicators of the gospel to the outside world, not be troubled by this theology that is really unhelpful for them. So I find that quite a helpful way of thinking about Paul. And it, of course, leads into thinking about Paul as a model for people in lockdown. We have very quickly, as a denomination, as a movement, we've very quickly gone online. We've adopted Zoom and all sorts of techie platforms to project ourselves into the ether in the hope that there is an audience out there paying attention. But I'm also struck by the number of my ministers in training who've reported back to me that they have also gone very old school in how they are communicating. So many of them have gone over to producing a script for their sermon, which they can then print, put in an envelope, and put through the doors of people who cannot access it in any other way, because they don't, they have lots of their congregations are not wired for sound and vision. They only have the ability to communicate either by post or perhaps by email. And so very old school ministers are putting sermons through doors. They are putting sermons onto CDs for people to listen to in the comfort of their own homes. And they are doing some of the things that you identified in this importance of envoys, of communicating with a congregation in a non-face-to-face sort of a way. So I found that very helpful. I found your homeschooling thing very helpful as well, this idea of gathering of necessity people, and you not being able to move, but people being able to come to you. And of course, there's lots of examples in Paul's letters of people coming to visit him when he's in prison, particularly think of Epaphroditus, who came, got very ill, wherever imprisoned at that point, and Paul was keen to send him back, and maybe he sent him back with the letter that we now call Philippians, but keen to send him back to tell the church that he was all right. But he had come to visit Paul, and no doubt come to bring some of the things that a Roman prisoner would need outsiders to bring, like food and clothes and money to pay his jailer and that sort of practical support, but also able to then to act as an envoy, as you rightly stress. So I think there was really quite helpful things in what you had to say and share with us, for which I'm grateful.
I like your word crafting that you talked about, the crafting of the letter. And I wonder whether, yes, during lockdown, we may or may not be writing as much, but I wonder whether our sermons are more crafted than they may otherwise have been, as we suddenly realize it's not going to be the 50, the 100, 150 people in the congregation, and I can see the whites of their eyes. Who knows how long this is going to be viewable by potentially many hundreds of people. And there's a lot of pain and nervousness about doing that. But suddenly, have we had to change the medium? Changing the medium, has that changed how we prepare, and now we have something rather more crafted? Yeah,
I mean, I think preaching to your own computer screen, which is effectively what a lot of us are doing, is a very different discipline from preaching to a live audience, and you can't really do it in the same way. So I found myself, when I have been asked to preach, I have found myself being much more crafted in what I have created, much more concerned to keep to time, much more concerned not to go off on flights of fancy, which might make me lose the thread of what I'm saying and therefore pause and stop, which you're very conscious of when you are recording yourself, that there aren't all these pauses and stutters and kind of losing the thread and coming back to it and stopping for a drink and moving around the platform to give somebody a distraction from you having lost the thread. Can't do any of that when you're in front of a computer screen. You have to have something that's much more crafted. And I think that's what we have in Paul's letters, something that is much more crafted than he would have been in person. I suspect he would have taken much longer to say what he says in Philippians had he been there in person.
Yes, and the reverse side of that is what you and I can do. We don't know how many other people are watching in, because we can't see them, but you and I can have a conversation. And is that like the homeschooling for Paul in Acts 28? He can gather a much smaller group. We might use Zoom for this now, but have a different level of conversation. It's not the prepared talk, but it's the bearing of the hearts and the listening and the participation and the interaction. And whether I wonder whether a lot of churches have found that going to the Zoom context with smaller numbers of people has created new opportunities for a different kind of connection that we might lose if we revert too quickly.
I have that same fear, I think, of us losing what we might have learned in lockdown. And I agree that some of what we're able to do over Zoom and some of the other interactive platforms is that we are able to have much more of a conversation, much more of a dialogue, much more of a question and answer. So it's not just a monologue sermon. Sometimes we can put something out there and invite questions. How does this apply? How do I do that? That's all very interesting, but that kind of thing that we often don't do when we're live in church, but maybe should do more of. But over some of these interactive technical platforms, we can actually interact with one another, be much more conversational, much more dialogical than we might be.
So following on from
Sorry, I just thought I wanted to jump in, partly because I want to be part of the conversation here, partly because I do want to say to people, do put your questions in on the chat box. We've got time to answer some of those if you have any questions or queries. And can I just come in on that? I just wanted to ask about, I guess, the place then of oratory, because you also see Paul, of course, standing before the council or in the marketplace, and I guess using an orator's skill. Is that something we're going to need less as we look ahead, do you think, Simon?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, it depends on how you see Acts as a reliable source of information about Paul. Now, I think it's a reliable source of information about Paul, but I do wonder whether Paul's oratory is much more Lucan than Pauline sometimes. I'd be interested to know what Andrew thinks about that. And therefore, when we read in Paul's letters about Paul's sense of his own oratory, he seems to accept that he was not much of a public presence. He was much better in print than he was in person. He seems to acknowledge that. And that's obviously something that the Corinthians in particular were very upset about, because the Corinthians seemed to set great store by the oratorical skill of the person who was teaching them, not so much store by the sense of what was being taught. But I think it is something that we might have to learn to do better than maybe we have done in the past, which is to be able to communicate in a way that invites people into a conversation and that isn't just us holding forth for 20 minutes, half an hour, but actually is us generating a conversation so that people can join in.
Yeah, very much the homeschooling model. Yeah, Andrew.
I wonder, just coming on the back of that, whether another thing we could look at is this whole question as to whether, well, if Paul has strengths in some types of ministry and not so much in others, do we now need to look at ourselves and recognize that actually there are certain parts of this ministry I ought humbly to leave to other people. People have expected me to fulfill a certain role. Life has changed. Churches are moving on. Society's moved on. And I may need now to step back and say, I'm going to focus on this. You focus on that, because you're evidently more well equipped to handle that platform than I am.
And I think maybe just following through on that is the idea that, as some people would say, when they preach off a few notes. They look for the inspiration of the Spirit in the moment. As you said, Simon, very difficult to do when you can't see the whites of the eyes of those you're preaching to, when you're just speaking to a screen. So I'm just wondering how we get this balance between, I suppose, a more cerebral approach of crafting something which will be there for posterity, it's written down, as opposed to preaching in the heat of the moment, and whether there's a tension there between those two.
Yeah, there is a tension. I mean, I think depending on how you read 1 Corinthians 14, the tension is there between the spontaneous eruption of prophecy in a gathering and the much more settled delivery of a prophecy that somebody has been working on through the week, the kind of sweated word rather than the spontaneous word. And it seems to me that Paul is talking about both of those being necessary in the gathering. But he's also saying that it's not the same person who has all the words. The whole point of what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 14 is that the words come from all directions, and it is for the group gathered, however large that group was, and I'm of the view they were probably 20 to 30 or so in a workshop, end of the day, the end of a meal, everybody then joining in the conversation. So there could be 7 or 8 people bringing a word. There could be 2 or 3 people who've been working on a word for the week. They've been having this thought persisting with them through the week that they have wanted to share. And as they have thought it through, it's become more and more crafted. And that's why Paul says, well, the person who is speaking can stop if somebody receives a revelation there and then, because the person who was speaking knows what he's about to say and will therefore be able to say it once the person who's received an immediate prophecy would have finished. So I think there's a place for both, but I think what comes out of that passage and what comes out of all of Paul's teaching about the gifts of the Spirit, I guess, is that every member of the congregation has a voice, and that voice needs to be allowed to speak. And maybe the minister's role is much more as conductor of the voices, as the voice in chief, if you like. We're there to conduct the contributions of everybody rather than be the person who says everything.
Yeah. We've got a question come in here from Jonathan Davis. Thank you, Jonathan, for this. And Andrew, I wonder whether we could address this to you. Thinking about how Paul's letters were received, would the envoy have been simply a postman, or would they have read the letter out to the church? And what authority would the envoy themselves have?
That's very good. Thank you, Jonathan, for that. I think we do need to ask these kinds of questions. Quite a lot of scholarship has been done on envoys and letter carriers. That's a title you can look up and see quite a lot of literature on that. And the sense was that envoys did come with the authority of the person who had written the letter. So envoys would be handpicked. Much as we're fielding questions at the moment, there would have been a sense that having read out the letter, this envoy within the church community would be expected to respond and say, and people would ask questions effectively of Paul, but of course only the envoy can receive these questions and immediately respond. This is what he meant. And perhaps even these envoys might have embellished elements of the letter, which would have taken some while to read. So definitely an authoritative, a hand-picked person, and Paul speaks very highly indeed of Timothy, Titus, Epaphras, Epaphroditus, very, very valued colleagues and partners. And yes, they would not simply have said, by the way, here's the letter, read it yourselves, and I'll send back a reply when you've had time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think if you look at the end of Romans, look at chapter 16, and the work that's been done by a variety of scholars on identifying how many groups there might have been Paul is writing to. So Peter Lamper talking about possibly 5 or 7 different house churches. And Paul at the start of Romans 16 commending Phoebe, who is the patron to Paul, possibly the person who has put in place the trip that Paul wants to make to Spain. This is Robert Jewett's argument. And I have this sense of Phoebe as the first person ever to do an expository series on Romans. You know, we all aspire to do that. Well, Phoebe probably took the letter, and she was the person who was asked all those awkward questions. And it would have taken weeks to deliver Romans in those conversations. You couldn't read the whole 16 chapters in one sitting to a group of people who were going, but what does that mean? And how does that apply? And what does he mean by this? And so I have the sense that there would have been the people who took the letters would have been the first people to answer all those questions that we get asked in a Bible study when we're doing something on one of these letters. Naturally, those questions would have arisen with the first audience, and the letter carrier was the person entrusted by Paul with not only delivering, but actually handling the contents of the letter in the way that Paul had intended.
So what then is the application for us today? Because in one sense, we don't require envoys insofar as, I mean, here we are in London, Birmingham, and Scotland, and in half an hour's time we could be speaking to people anywhere else we want to via these means we've got. So does this have relevance now? I'm particularly thinking, Andrew, where you said it may be we need to recognise others are better at certain things than we are. I'm just wondering how envoys would work today, how they would be useful.
Yes, I don't know whether envoys would have a role, but I do think we might well have a diversifying of roles. I'm interested that you were talking earlier on, Simon, from 1 Corinthians 14. One of the things that I perceive, and this looks like Zoom to me on the screen, it's a different platform, but there is no front of the church here. We all have exactly the same amount of real estate on the screen. There's no pointy end of the church. It's an equalizer, and that allows the learning to happen not from one direction but in the middle, as in that 1 Corinthians 14. But then others might be much better equipped at doing the more formal presentation that will be kept preserved for all posterity on YouTube. And I think we could well diversify and see different strengths and skills here.
It seems to me we need both of those things, don't we? We need the people who are going to be able to structure a piece of teaching for everybody to listen to and think about. But then we also need to have the ability, or the forum in which we might be able then to test out what we've just heard, to ask questions about it, to do the work of how does this apply in the groups that we are particularly involved in within our own congregation, or how do I take this into my workplace? How do I take this into my neighborhood group, to my neighbors? How do I take this into a conversation over dinner with the people that I will be meeting sometime this week, once we're allowed to have conversations over dinner again, actually live around a table? I think there's a need for all of this, and in one sense, this is how we do church already. I think we've picked this up. I think one of the things we learn from this whole envoy, letter carrier, people explaining on behalf of somebody else is learning to trust the voices of other people and not want to control everything that is said within the congregation. And it seems to me that part of the ministerial art is developing trust in all the voices within church, so that people can speak and they can be heard as equals.
So perhaps a key learning is that rather than just pressing on trying to force our previous ministry into a new medium, we just need to step back and think, well, what are the strengths of the medium, and who is best to actually meet those or work with those strengths, and where do we need to adjust our own ministry accordingly? Yeah. We do, again, if you're watching this and you want to ask a question, do encourage you to do so. We've got a few minutes left in which we can reply to things. There was one verse, Andrew, it was on the screen, I'm not sure whether you read it, which was in one sense the cause of this whole webinar, which is the very end of Acts, where it talks about Paul under house arrest in Rome, preaching the kingdom boldly and without hindrance, which was a fascinating combination of freedom and yet constraint. Do you think that verse is, again, another example of sort of hyperbole from Luke, this sort of without hindrance? Or do you think, no, there really was a freedom to that?
That's really interesting. Yes, with all boldness and without hindrance. Clearly, there were hindrances in the sense that he was locked down. So I wonder whether we're talking instead about what was the phrase that is like from an earlier church culture that talked about great liberty. I preached with liberty. I didn't feel constrained. I felt I could just, I don't know, let rip. And I wonder whether that's the kind of sense that we've got there. So boldness and without hindrance, qualifying each other. I felt free and no internal hindrances here, just to declare boldly this message.
Yeah.
And of course, there was a sense in which, apart from the fact he was lightly chained to a guard who probably changed every few hours, people could come and go from him. I don't know how much he could move around the house that he was imprisoned in, but you get the sense that it was a fairly light custodial environment. So we didn't have people coming and going. There was this sense, maybe, you could translate it into contemporary parlance. He had gatherings with another household from outside his own household. People would come, maybe one or two households. Maybe they would have to be socially distant because the guards would not allow people to get very close to Paul, just in case they tried to do something that would spring him from his imprisonment. So there was a kind of socially distant gathering of some kind. But you have that kind of sense that Paul was able to conduct a ministry pretty much without let or hindrance. It's just he couldn't travel.
Yeah. And meantime, the guards are accidentally discipled, I suppose.
Yes, quite. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the room or whatever. Yeah. Well, I'm still looking at our chat box. We haven't had any further comments, but Andrew, Simon, are there things you particularly wanted to ask each other, or just discuss a little bit further to the last couple of minutes before we end? There
was something I was going to observe as coming out of lockdown. Can we learn things from Paul as we come out of lockdown? And I've lost count of the number of Baptist ministers that I've had some kind of conversation with, either live or over Facebook, about the documentation that has been published in order to allow churches to reopen. And at the same time, I've been reading the story of Lydia in Acts, and how Paul came to Europe, the dream of the Macedonian man, because all the doors in Asia Minor seemed to be closed to him. And what Paul was hoping for when he arrived in Europe, and what Paul actually encountered, being entirely different. He had a dream of a Macedonian man, and he met a Thyatirian woman. So that was different. He had a dream probably of meeting this man in a synagogue, because that's what he generally did when he was going into a new synagogue. There wasn't a synagogue in Philippi, it seems, or he couldn't go there. So he went down to the river where he encountered this group of women. And it seemed that God was saying, well, you got all these plans of what you're going to do, but actually this is what I had in mind for you. And I've been talking to my minister and other ministers about, as we come out of lockdown, should we go back to our buildings, or should we? It's because it's summer. Maybe we should do some gatherings in our local parks, a few socially distanced groups who can meet together, pray together, share a picnic together, read the Bible together, do the kinds of things that Paul did in Philippi in those very, very early days. And that might be a lesson that Paul is also teaching us, which is to be very flexible in the way that we do things, follow the Spirit rather than make a plan.
Well, we have got one further. Andrew, unless you want to just follow in on that, I've got another question otherwise waiting in the wings.
Just quickly, Simon, before that question, I think you're right. We do need to reflect. And one of the things that I wonder about, at the moment, it's relatively easy to invite friends and neighbours, family members to church, because they don't actually have to darken the doors. They don't even have to be visible. They can simply watch. And during this, strangely, during the lockdown, we have been able to use the words of the psalmist, tell among the nations what he has done. When we come out of lockdown, will we lock ourselves down in church? and close the doors, and suddenly what was open becomes locked down again?
Yeah,
that's a great question. Yeah. Well, one further question here. I'll bring it up onto the screen. This might need to be the last one actually today. Just looking at the time from Sharon Peters. Thank you, Sharon. And this is back to the envoys again. We're missing the input of some very important people in the envoys. Does this have implications for how we interpret Paul's letter? And do we need to look for prophetic envoys for our time? As I read that, it makes me wonder about those who see themselves, I think they would call it, in apostolic roles as going from church to church. I don't know what that question evokes for you. I wonder if I can direct that to Andrew.
No, I'm very happy for Simon to pick this one up as well. I'm just trying to get my mind around it. Does this have implications for how we should reinterpret Paul's letter? Do we need to look for prophetic envoys for our time? Is what's behind this question the idea that there were envoys, they had a key role, but we have no equivalent for that today?
That I don't know. Sharon may reply, but there's a delay usually in when we are talking and it going out on YouTube, so it may not come in time, but we'll wait and see. Simon, do you want to?
Well, I think one of the things that this whole conversation about envoys reminds us of is that communication of the story that Paul lived by was not a solo enterprise. It was not just Paul, and you kind of took it and left it as Paul dropped it on your doormat, as it were. There are a whole lot of people involved in the production of what Paul produced. There are very few letters, for instance, that don't come from Paul and somebody else, and you wonder how much influence, think about Titus and Sosthenes and others who were the co-authors. Were they just there taking up space in the workshop, or were they actually contributing to the way the letter was composed? Does this account for some of the differences in the way that letters read from to different communities? So there's this idea somehow that the envoys allows us to have a conversation about how many people are involved in the production of a message, a story. And then we're back in 1 Corinthians 14, that lots of voices get heard so that everybody understands what God wants of us. And I think that the key thing about envoys, and I would say amen to the need for prophetic envoys of our time, that the key thing is that they enable lots of voices to be heard, and God therefore to make clear to us what it is he wants us to do in the community of people.
Okay. Well, thank you. I wonder whether, particularly that takeaway, that question of whether the church will return to locking itself down once we, in theory, have more freedom to meet. I think that's a great question, and for us to wonder how being more in the public sphere through some of the digital means at the moment actually should continue some of that dialogical way of working as well. So plenty to think about. Andrew and Simon, can I say a massive thank you for taking part, and God bless you in your ongoing ministries in Scotland and at Spurgeon's College, respectively. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to wrap up. Again, just a reminder that this evening, as usual, at 7 o'clock, we've got a prayer broadcast, and that is with Lynn Green and with Alistair Mitchell-Baker, who's chair of the BUGB trustees. Or join us next week for our webinar on what would the Celts do in lockdown, and that is with Roy Searle and Leslie McLean. And I just do want to add that if at this time you are finding yourself, again, quite exhausted, in need of some space, I would recommend the Quiet Day that we had live last week, but is available as a recording on the webinars page, with Jeff Colmer and Beth Powney leading through a number of reflections that you can take as much or as little time over as you want. Of course, that's the beauty of watching it as a recording. You have a fast forward button or a pause button. So do use that as a facility if you want to reflect and find some space in the middle of this rather crazy season. But for me, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us, and God bless you, and goodbye.